We're back with Ryan from Carson Law, exploring today's subject matter, which is rent-to-own contracts. What are maybe some of the common problems that come up when you see clients doing rent-to-own contracts? And then what are some common terms and conditions that people maybe should consider putting into place in order to hopefully maybe avoid some of these common issues?
So there's three main documents, legal documents that you'll need for a successful rent-to-own.
Okay. And so just kind of curious, if someone's thinking about getting into rent-to-own, so they're looking to do a deal, do I literally just reach out to you or my lawyer and say, hey, I want to get a rent-to-own package? How customizable are these contracts? And, how specific to the individual deal or arrangement? Or do you find that a lot of them come kind of in a cookie cutter, oh, there's kind of a standard process for this? What is up, YouTube? Matt McKeever here, and we're back with Ryan from Carson Law. Hey, Ryan, how's it going?
Hey, Matt, how are you doing? Great to be here again.
Yeah, I'm doing well. And so looking forward to exploring today's subject matter, which is rent-to-own contracts. Definitely an area I'm not an expert in, so I'm hoping you can enlighten me on this. But let's chat through what are maybe some of the common problems that come up when you see clients doing rent-to-own contracts. And then what are some common terms and conditions that people maybe should consider putting into place in order to hopefully maybe avoid some of these common issues?
Yeah. I mean, where we might want to start actually is what are the main documents, right? That
Sure.
You need to make a successful rent-to-own. And then obviously that will easily segue us into some of those other points that you just mentioned. So there's three main documents, legal documents that you'll need for a successful rent-to-own. You'll have an actual agreement of purchase and sale, whereby you're going to have somebody buying a property on behalf of the tenant buyer who's going to be renting from you to eventually own, right? So usually the company coordinating the rent to own is acquiring the property for the tenant buyer. So you need the purchase and sale agreement with the actual person you're buying the property from, right? Mm-hmm. Then you have two additional agreements that make the rent to own unique, which is you have a option to purchase with the tenant buyer, right? Because they're going to be a tenant of yours for typically, we usually see 2 to 4 years as the common rent to own period of time. Sometimes you could see them for maybe only a year, and sometimes you might see them for 4+ years, but typically 3-4 is a sweet spot that we see most rent to owns drawn up for. It gives them sufficient time to be able to go through the process of the proper payments to save the money for the eventual purchase, right? But basically you've got that purchase agreement, you've got that option of purchase agreement, which is with the tenant buyer and the short-term homeowner, the rent-to-own company. And then the last one is the actual tenant agreement, because you're in a landlord-tenant situation theoretically for that rent-to-own period of a year or a couple years. And so you would need to have, for a successful rent-to-own, the agreement of purchase and sale with the actual current homeowner, the seller. You would need to have an option to purchase agreement with the person who buys it on behalf of the rent-to-own company for the tenant buyer. And then that option of purchase is with the tenant buyer. And then there is the lease agreement while they're in a rental situation, so to speak.
Gotcha. So essentially 3 contracts. And if I already own the property, then I'd really just need the 2 contracts?
Correct. Yeah, you could do an option to purchase agreement and a rental agreement.
Okay. And so just kind of curious, if someone's thinking about getting into rent-to-own, so they're looking to do a deal, do I literally just reach out to you or my lawyer and say, hey, I want to get a rent-to-own package? How customizable are these contracts? And, how specific to the individual deal or arrangement? Or do you find that a lot of them come kind of in a cookie cutter, oh, there's kind of a standard process for this?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, definitely they can reach out to us. We'd definitely be able to help. I mean, we've drawn all these 3 contracts up for people in the past, and we'll continue to do so in the future. Depending on like whether you're an experienced person in rent owns, like a lot of times our experienced rent own clients do it all in-house themselves. Or sometimes if you're doing it more as like a one-off or just trying to get into it, there are like these rent to own companies that you basically team up with and more or less be like, hey, I currently own this property, but we really like the concept of rent to own. You guys are a rent to own company. Could you just kind of manage the process for us for a fee, and we'll be the sellers and so forth, with the rent to own tenants, right? So I think there's probably 2 or 3 ways it could happen, but the short answer of who could they reach out for help if they don't really know how to get started, for sure us, as lawyers, we could definitely help them and would be happy to do so.
Gotcha. Yeah, definitely appreciate that. And so I imagine when we're talking about those 3 contracts, the original purchase and sale where I'm buying the property off of the seller, that probably doesn't look much different or really any different at all, right? When doing a rent to own deal.
That's right. Like you're right. The agreement of purchase and sale is very, very much the same as just a regular purchase and sale agreement.
Gotcha. And then, so when we're looking at the normal lease agreement, is there anything that needs to be kind of, taken in consideration when drawing that up for a rent to own arrangement?
Well, one thing that people will try to do, again, I don't know how successful it is on like an enforcement point of view, but maybe from a deterrent point of view, people will try to basically call it not even like a residential lease like governed, but they'll specifically say it's not a lease, it's an occupancy agreement, because they don't want to get caught by being buckled into the landlord tenant legislation and the Rent and Residential Tenancies Act and so forth. So I think people will, in some cases, try to maneuver it to make it a different type of agreement, like not use the residential lease agreement, but that the Ontario government has, but have it be like an occupant agreement where it specifically says, hey, the parties are in an occupancy arrangement. It's for a set term. The parties all agree that the landlord tenant, legislation doesn't apply. It's not a landlord tenant situation. I don't know if you push came to shove, if it went to court, whether or not you'd be successful in being able to circumvent the Residential Tenancies Act of Ontario, but it can certainly, at least on the face of it, be a bit of a deterrent from somebody trying to bring an action under that.
Right.
Sometimes people just look at it and say, hey, we agreed that, we're in an occupancy and we're not landlord tenants. So, how would we possibly bring an action like this against somebody? Right. So
Gotcha.
I mean, that's something that if you can do, I recommend it, because you want to try to make it so that ultimately, if the person can't buy the property as a tenant buyer, which happens from time to time, not frequently, but it does happen. Something might happen that it can't qualify for the mortgage at the end of the day that they thought they could, or they can't get enough money saved up as part of the deposit under the occupancy agreement. Who knows, right? In that particular case, that's why it's good for it to be more of an occupancy agreement as opposed to a residential lease agreement, because you've got wording in this occupancy agreement that's going to say part of the monthly payment that you've been making, yes, it goes to just rent, but or an occupancy fee, but the other half or portion is going towards down payment. And so it's like you're down paying on the property as part of the occupancy fee month to month. And so if you can't close and you as the tenant buyer are in breach of the occupancy agreement, it means you will forfeit that, and that amount goes to the owner.
Gotcha. Yeah. And so I imagine this is one of those situations where really, the devil is in the details. And so when you're looking at whether occupancy or rental agreement or what sort of hybrid approach, you probably really want to sit down with your lawyer or paralegal or an experienced rent-to-own operator and just kind of flesh out all the details behind the exact arrangement that you're working out with your tenant buyer or your potential tenant buyer.
Exactly. Yeah. 100%. Yeah. Draw on their expertise, knowledge, and experience, whether it's an experienced rent to own operator or a lawyer familiar with rent to owns. Yeah, absolutely. You want to do that, and it'll save you a bunch of headaches for sure.
And then let's talk about that last one, the option to purchase. Now, this is going to be a type of agreement that, unless you've done a rent own before, you probably haven't really came across, right, as a real estate investor. So do you mind just high level breaking down what that is and maybe some of the key aspects or terms and conditions people should be aware of?
Yeah, I mean, so the option to purchase is just really the contractual agreement between the tenant buyer and the person who becomes, the homeowner on the normal purchase, right? And so it's that rent to own company that is going to be the person who potentially could sell to the tenant buyer. And that's what will be outlined within this option to purchase agreement. As I mentioned, I think one key aspect is to clearly define like the term of it. How long is this going to be? Clearly define, hopefully that, this is not a landlord tenant situation. The tenancy legislation of the province doesn't apply, or, if this is in the US, a state, you want it to be basically, hopefully just governed by the contract and contract law, and not necessarily potential, provincial or state legislation that creates very friendly rights typically for tenants, right? You want to make sure you're sort of controlling the situation more contractually than governed by legislation. So having the parties named in it, the term, making sure it's hopefully circumventing around being part of landlord tenant legislation, and clearly delineating, you have to pay this much money a month for your occupancy fee to live in the property. And from that, a certain portion is going to like the cost of the occupancy, but then the other portion is going towards your down payment of the eventual closing date, which would also be in the occupancy, the option to purchase agreement as well. So those would be like, I think your key terms and everything. And then circling back to just that, option to purchase amount that's kind of getting put aside for the down payment or the deposit. You'd want to make sure at the end of the day, it's very clearly delineated if there is a breach, what constitutes a possible breach of the agreement, and what happens when there's a breach, which is normally, they have to immediately vacate and are on the hook for any damages and so forth to the property if they damage it when they're leaving or while they've been there. And then finally that they forfeit that money that's been building up as a deposit or down payment.
Yeah, definitely appreciate you breaking that out for us. And then so let's kind of walk through to the finality of the transaction, assuming things go well, that the tenant buyer does decide that they are going to buy and close on the property. Does that end up just looking like a normal purchase and sale agreement once it actually comes time to execute upon things?
That's right. Yeah, you're right. So it starts with a traditional and normal purchase where the rent-own company is buying from the person who owns it. And then there's these two agreements that kind of deal with the stuff in the middle, which is the lease agreement, or as I said, make it an occupancy agreement with the option to purchase. And then you get to the end of that term and it becomes essentially just another normal purchase and sale.
Gotcha. Awesome. Yeah. Appreciate you kind of walking us through from start to finish some of the legal aspects, considerations, and contracts necessary when it comes to rent owns. I guess before we wrap this up, any other, just insights or cautions or any other perspectives you want to share with the audience when it comes to rent owns?
I mean, I would encourage people to look at it as something, to consider when you're, trying to round out your real estate investment portfolio. I think out of all the options that are out there for real estate investing, it's definitely one that I think is kind of underutilized potentially. I mean, I'm certainly not saying, hey, everybody go do rent to owns and just rent to own, but just like, if you sit down with somebody at the bank or somebody giving you advice about like, old school investing in like, just the market, everybody would always talk about diversification, right? Like, don't just go buy 1,000 stocks all in the one thing and don't do anything with anything else, right? Don't put your eggs all in one basket. I mean, the same thing can kind of be true about kind of this new world of real estate investing, which, many of the people watching and subscribing to you and following you are part of, which is, take control of your ability to make money and invest, but through real estate, right? And a lot of people would know about like the BRRRRs. A lot of people would potentially know and be utilizing like assignment type deals. People might be doing buy and holds or buy and flips. People might be doing private lending. But I would say there's not as many people kind of looking at that rent to own option. And I think, it's a nice sort of like fourth, fifth option to loop in and tie in with some of your, with whatever else you're considering or doing for diversification, right? The other part, and this is a little bit more of like, I guess, the humanity side coming out, which is you get to feel good about like helping people that are probably in a pretty tough spot. Usually the people that are involved in a rent to own as your tenant buyer, occupant buyer, are people who had something happen to them that kind of maybe damaged their credit, but they're working to rebuild it and they want that joy of home ownership, but just can't get it right now. So there's a bit of that like human side where the feel good story is kind of built in. So if you're somebody who's in like, the beginnings of looking at like your real estate investment strategy and like what you might want to do, and if like having that feel good story in your real estate investing matters, rent to own is something that could potentially deliver, because you're finding people that want home ownership, but unfortunately, can't quite get there yet. And so you're kind of helping them get there a bit sooner, right? And make it a reality. So it's a bit of a feel good story, I guess, as well as making a good, return on your investment, of course, which is, one of the goals for anybody involved in real estate investing too, right? So I think those are two real positive things about it. I guess a caution, which really ties into everything we just talked about, which is, if you're not that familiar with it, or even if you are, but you feel like you need, to kind of beef it up or shake it up, have a lawyer, real estate investor lawyer like us that's familiar with all the different options out there, take a look, give you a second opinion, maybe give you some revisions on your documents, maybe beef them up, make sure you're protected so that, what you want to see happen, in fact, will happen. Right. And if stuff does hit the fan, make sure you know exactly what your step 1, 2, and 3 are, so that you can deal with it and move forward. Right.
Yeah. Really appreciate you sharing that, and I completely agree. There definitely are some great opportunities when it comes to rent to owns. I think that it's a strategy that a lot of investors either misunderstand or sometimes are completely oblivious to, particularly newer investors entering this space. And as you mentioned, it can be a great opportunity for a win-win between you and your tenant buyers. So really do encourage people to look into it, and just be aware that when it comes to these sorts of rent-to-own deals or structures, not necessarily every single real estate lawyer is going to be familiar with it. So I think making sure that, whoever you bring on your team to help you go through this, you kind of want to make sure it's not going to be their first time structuring a rent-to-own deal as well. So again, I encourage you guys to reach out to Ryan or any competent lawyer. But if you guys want to reach out to Ryan, we've got a link in the video description down below where you guys can hit up Carson Law. Really encourage you to do that. And again, just appreciate you sharing your insights and experience here, Ryan.
Oh, thanks a lot. Thanks very much.